The date is the 28th of October, 1492. A Spanish sailor named Rodrigo de Jerez steps out of a longboat onto the northeast shore of what he does not yet know is Cuba, and into a scene so strange he will spend the rest of his life trying to explain it. In a clearing of thatched huts, Taino villagers are holding rolled bundles of dried leaves to their lips. One end glows. Smoke pours from their nostrils in slow gray ribbons. They inhale, hold, exhale, and pass the bundle on, unhurried, as if breathing fire were the most ordinary thing in the world. Christopher Columbus, writing that same week in his log, calls the leaves certain dried herbs the natives value greatly. He does not understand what he is looking at. Neither does Jerez. But Jerez, curious, takes a draw. He is, by every surviving record, the first European in history to smoke. He carries the habit home to the small Spanish town of Ayamonte. Neighbors see smoke rising from his mouth in the street and are so terrified they report him to the Holy Office of the Inquisition. The court agrees. Only a man possessed could exhale like that. Rodrigo de Jerez is imprisoned for roughly 7 years for the crime of smoking. By the time he walks free, half of Spain is doing the same thing. Hold that image. A sailor jailed as a devil for a habit that, 400 years later, 1 in every 3 adults on the planet will share, because the story you think you know about tobacco, Columbus, cowboys, cigarettes, cancer is only the surface. The real story starts more than 2,000 years before that longboat touched the sand. It runs through Mayan temples and Jamestown swamps, through Glasgow mansions and Havana rolling floors, through the ledgers of the largest fortunes ever built, and the lungs of 100 million dead. It is the story of a single American leaf that hooked, enriched, enslaved, and finally killed more people than any product in human history. And its ghost is still around you, right now, in words and streets and faces you have never once questioned. Long before any European saw a cigar, the leaf was already sacred. Walk into the ruins of Palenque, in the jungle of what is now Chiapas, southern Mexico, and look closely at the limestone reliefs carved around 600 to 700 AD. On one panel, a priest tilts his head back and blows a plume of smoke toward a serpent god. In his hand is a tube, a rolled bundle of leaves wrapped in maize husk. Archaeologists call it, without much romance, the earliest depiction of smoking in the world. The Maya called it something closer to prayer. The species in that priest's hand was almost certainly Nicotiana rustica, a squat, wild cousin of the tobacco we know today. It is up to 10 times stronger in nicotine, hallucinogenic in high doses, and it grew across the highlands of Mesoamerica for millennia before the pyramids at Palenque were even planned. The evidence suggests farmers in the Andes were cultivating tobacco as far back as 5000 BC, which means humans had a relationship with this plant older than writing, older than the wheel, older than most of the gods we still name. But the Maya did not smoke to relax. They smoked to cross over. Priests inhaled the thick smoke of rustica to enter trance states, to speak with ancestors, to divine rainfall in war. Smoke was the visible shape of a prayer rising. In the Popol Vuh, the sacred Quiché Maya text, written down in the 16th century, but drawing on far older traditions, the hero twins are tested in the underworld by being given lit cigars and ordered to keep them burning through the night without consuming them. An impossible task, and a clue to how central the burning leaf had become to their cosmology. You have to hold 2 things in your head at once here. This was not the tobacco of a truck stop cigarette. This was a plant so potent that a shaman, using it correctly, might, quite literally, stop breathing. Colonial-era accounts describe Central American healers falling into stiff, corpse-like trances after inhaling rustica smoke, then rising hours later to prescribe cures. To the Maya, that was not overdose. That was the point. And the smoke was everywhere. It rose from the courtyards of Tikal, in the lowland Guatemalan rainforest, where kings received foreign envoys. It curled through the ball courts of Copan, in modern Honduras, where the game's outcome was read as prophecy. Aztec nobles, arriving late to this tradition around the 14th century, smoked hollow reeds packed with tobacco and aromatic resins after their meals in Tenochtitlan. The city Cortez would later burn to the ground. When the Spanish finally arrived in 1519, they described tobacco use as universal, ceremonial, and utterly matter-of-fact, from the palace to the marketplace. So the leaf Rodrigo de Jerez saw in Cuba was not a novelty. It was the tail end of a religious civilization 2 millennia deep. What Europe would soon call a vice was, in its birthplace, a form of communion. And that inversion, from prayer to product, is the story that follows. But before Palenqua's priests, before even the Maya, someone had to first pull that plant out of the soil and decide it was worth keeping. To find them, you have to look further south and far earlier. Picture a small clearing in the forested hills of Hispaniola, the island shared today by Haiti and the Dominican Republic, sometime in the 10th century. Women bend over neat rows of a broad-leafed plant, pinching off flower buds, so that all the vigor of the stalk pours downward into the leaves. This is called topping, and it is one of the oldest specialized techniques in agriculture. The Taino, an Arawak-speaking people who had migrated from South America into the Caribbean over the preceding 1,000 years, already knew it. They knew when to harvest. They knew how to string leaves in the rafters of open-sided huts to cure, and they knew how to roll them. They called the roll cohiba, 2 syllables that would, centuries later, end up on the band of the most famous cigar brand on earth. But in a Taino village around 1000 AD, cohiba was not a luxury. It was a tool of medicine, negotiation, and welcome. A visitor to a village would be offered smoke the way a European guest might be offered wine. Refusing was rude. Sharing sealed alliances between chiefdoms, the caciques who ruled each valley, and healers used it to disinfect wounds, to lull screaming children, and, remarkably, to expel intestinal parasites, a use modern pharmacology has since confirmed as at least partially effective, because nicotine in high enough doses paralyzes many gutworms. The genius of the Taino was not just in growing tobacco, it was in domesticating it. The plant Europeans would come to worship, Nicotiana tabacum, is not a wild species. It exists nowhere in nature. It is a hybrid that emerged only under human care, most likely from a cross between 2 wild ancestors in the Andes around 8,000 years ago, then carried north by traders, pilgrims, and migrants until it reached the Caribbean. Every leaf ever smoked in a London tavern or a Parisian salon descends from a plant that a farmer, whose name we will never know, selected and kept alive on purpose. That is the definition of a domesticated crop, and it belongs to the indigenous Americas as surely as maize or the potato. By the time Columbus's men waded ashore, the Taino grew tobacco in cleared plots they called canucos, raised mounds of soil planted with a canny mix of yucca, sweet potato, beans, and the sacred leaf itself. It was a low-labor, high-yield system that the Spanish, watching starving colonists die of scurvy a generation later, would fail to imitate. When a Taino cacique welcomed a stranger, he did so seated in a duho, a low ceremonial stool carved from hardwood, and the pipe or cohiba came out of a woven basket at his elbow. Smoke drifted, questions were asked, gifts were exchanged, diplomacy had a scent. Within 50 years of Jerez's imprisonment, most of the Taino were dead. Smallpox, forced labor in Spanish gold mines, and outright massacre reduced a population of perhaps several 100,000 on Hispaniola to a few thousand. Their language, their religion, their villages, gone. But the crop they had spent centuries perfecting survived them, and so did a handful of their words. Hurricane, barbecue, canoe, hammock, tobacco. Every one of them a Taino inheritance, still on your tongue. And the leaf they had domesticated was about to save a very different colony, one that, without it, would have vanished as completely as they did. The Virginia Company's colony at Jamestown, planted in a mosquito-choked bend of the James River in 1607, should not have survived. Within 3 years, 4 out of every 5 settlers were dead. The winter of 1609 to 1610 is remembered in the colony's own letters as the starving time, when men ate boot leather, then rats, then, according to sworn testimony recorded in London, one another. When the survivors decided in June 1610 to abandon the settlement and sail home, only the last-minute arrival of a supply fleet at the mouth of the bay turned them back. Into this desperate colony, in 1610, stepped a young Englishman named John Rolfe. He had lost his wife and infant daughter in a shipwreck off Bermuda on the voyage over. He had lost his fortune, and he had brought with him in a small leather pouch a handful of seeds that were quite possibly stolen. Spain guarded its tobacco monopoly ferociously. Smuggling seeds out of Spanish territory was a capital offense. Where exactly Rolfe obtained them, Trinidad, Venezuela, Bermuda itself, is still debated. What is certain is what he did with them. He planted them in Virginia soil in 1611, and by 1612 he was curing the first crop, the tobacco already growing wild in Virginia. Cultivated by the Powhatan Confederacy, under Chief Wahunsenacka, the father of the woman English readers would later call Pocahontas, was Nicotiana rustica, that fierce Mesoamerican original. English smokers found it harsh, bitter, unbearable. Rolfe's smuggled seeds were the milder, sweeter Nicotiana tabacum the Spanish had been shipping from the Caribbean for a generation. When he sold his first small barrel in London in 1614, buyers noticed. When he sent 2,300 pounds in 1616, they cleared. By 1617, Jamestown shipped roughly 20,000 pounds of cured leaf across the Atlantic. By 1620, the number was 40,000. By 1630, it was over 1.5 million. A colony that had eaten its dead was suddenly the most valuable piece of English real estate outside London. Farmers tore up their kitchen gardens to plant tobacco. They planted it in the streets. Governor Sir Francis Wyatt had to issue orders in 1619 that a certain minimum acreage of corn be sown, because settlers were so obsessed with the cash crop that they were about to starve again, this time atop a fortune. Tobacco leaves became legal tender, church tithes, court fines, marriage licenses, even the transatlantic passage of English brides shipped to Jamestown in 1620 and 1621 as wives for lonely planters, all were priced not in pounds sterling but in pounds of leaf. Rolfe himself married Pocahontas in April 1614, and the union bought the colony a fragile peace with the Powhatan long enough for the tobacco fields to spread. He died around 1622, quietly, in Virginia. He never knew that the crop he had smuggled would, within a century, underwrite an empire, or that his gamble had just committed the English-speaking world to a leaf, and to everything the growing of that leaf would demand, because a plant this profitable could not stay in Virginia. It was already moving, up rivers, across oceans, into taverns and courts and clay pipe kilns all over Europe. The habit was about to industrialize. Imagine the court of Queen Elizabeth I sometime in the late 1580s, in a wood-paneled chamber at Whitehall Palace. A tall, saturnine courtier named Sir Walter Raleigh strolls in with a small silver pipe clenched in his teeth, exhaling gray smoke. A servant, seeing his master apparently on fire, hurls a tankard of ale over him. That story, told and retold in English pubs for 400 years, is almost certainly polished apocrypha. But the underlying fact is not. Raleigh, who had encouraged the earlier failed colony at Roanoke, made smoking fashionable in the highest circles of English society, and the fashion spread downward with astonishing speed. The Spanish had already built the trade's first great warehouse. In 1614, the Crown declared Sevilla the sole legal port for tobacco entering Europe, and the city's Casa de Contratación, the vast royal house of trade on the Guadalquivir River, began stamping and taxing every leaf that arrived from the New World. From Sevilla, Spanish factors carted the cured tobacco north to Antwerp, east to Genoa, and, quietly, into the smuggling boats of every rival power in Europe. Within a generation, French, Dutch, Portuguese, and English merchants had broken the monopoly, and Sevilla's grip loosened even as its rolling houses, the ancestors of the modern cigar factory, kept turning out cigars for the Spanish court. Meanwhile, in the small English port of Bristol, a new craft trade was being born to serve the habit. Because the leaf itself was rare and expensive, smokers wanted to burn as little as possible in a single sitting. The answer was the clay pipe, a thin white stem, no thicker than a swan's quill, ending in a tiny bowl the size of a thimble. The first English clay pipes appear in the archaeological record around 1580. By the 1620s, Bristol had dozens of pipe makers. By the 1680s, records list over 100 licensed pipe makers in Bristol alone, and the Dutch town of Gouda, which we now associate with cheese, was producing an estimated 20 million pipes a year for export across Europe. Clay pipes were cheap, disposable, and, if you dig anywhere in an old English port town today, you will still turn them up in the mud in staggering quantities. Archaeologists date sites by them, the way geologists date rocks, and with the pipe came a new kind of public room. In 1652, an Ottoman-born merchant named Pasqua Rosé opened London's first coffee house in a rented shed off St. Michael's Alley in the city. Coffee was the excuse. Tobacco was the atmosphere. Within 30 years, London had over 3,000 such houses, and every one of them was a fog of blue-gray smoke. Men sat elbow to elbow, pipe in one hand, newspaper in the other, and argued about war, prices, poetry, and the price of stocks. Lloyd's of London, the insurance market that still runs the shipping world, began in one such tobacco-hazed coffee house on Tower Street in 1686. The Royal Society of London for Improving Natural Knowledge, the world's oldest scientific academy, held informal meetings in another. The stock exchange grew out of Jonathan's, on Change Alley, where jobbers puffed and shouted prices through the smoke. The plant that Maya priests had used to speak with gods was now the ambient air of European capitalism. Every letter of credit signed in London in the 1690s was signed inside a haze of tobacco, and that haze was about to make a very small number of men extraordinarily rich. Walk down Virginia Street in central Glasgow today, past the sandstone facades and the coffee shops, and you are walking on top of a fortune most Scots have forgotten they built. Between 1740 and 1775, the merchants of this small, rain-soaked river port did something no economist would have predicted a generation earlier. They seized more than half of Britain's entire tobacco trade. At its peak in 1771, roughly 47 million pounds of Virginia and Maryland leaf passed through the Clyde, more than every English port combined. The men who ran that trade were called, half in admiration and half in resentment, the tobacco lords. They wore scarlet cloaks lined with black silk. They carried gold-topped canes. By an unwritten rule, they walked only on the raised paving of Virginia Street and the Trongate, and lesser Glasgow men stepped aside. Their names, John Glassford, Alexander Spears, William Cunningham, James Ritchie, still hang on street signs and on the walls of the Hunterian Museum. Glassford, at his death in 1783, was said to have handled over £500,000 sterling a year in tobacco transactions, a sum equivalent to hundreds of millions today. He owned 25 ships. He owned much of the west of Scotland, and he owned, according to his own inventory, at least 3 plantations in Virginia and Maryland, worked by hundreds of enslaved people whose names appear in his ledgers as line items alongside sacks of leaf. The Lord's genius was logistical rather than agricultural. They pioneered the store system. Instead of buying tobacco crop by crop at auction like their English rivals in London and Bristol, they set up permanent Scottish-run trading posts inland along the Chesapeake tobacco rivers. A planter in Virginia or Maryland could sell his crop, buy his sugar and his cloth and his nails, and settle his debts, all under one Glasgow-owned roof. It gave Glasgow first refusal on the best leaf, and it locked American planters into Scottish credit for generations. When the American Revolution broke out in 1775, roughly £1.3 million was owed to Glasgow merchants by Virginia planters alone, a debt the new United States would spend decades trying to renounce. While that river of money flowed, Glasgow reinvented itself. Cunningham built a Palladian mansion on Queen Street in 1780 so ostentatious that the city later bought it and turned it into what is now the Gallery of Modern Art. Glassford commissioned his own portrait from the Scottish painter Archibald MacLachlan, a group scene of the family in their drawing room, with a young enslaved African boy standing at the edge of the frame, painted over in later centuries and only partially recovered under X-ray. The city's Merchant City district, still a tourist quarter today, was laid out block by block with tobacco money. And when a young philosophy professor at the University of Glasgow named Adam Smith began writing about markets and free trade in the 1760s, he was doing it inside a city whose wealth flowed directly from a monopoly crop tended by enslaved laborers 3,000 miles away. He knew every tobacco lord personally. He mentioned them, not always warmly, in The Wealth of Nations. Then, almost overnight, the whole edifice cracked. The American War of Independence closed the Chesapeake to British shipping in 1775. Fleets rotted at anchor. Debts were repudiated. Within a decade, the tobacco lords had pivoted their capital into cotton mills, sugar plantations in the West Indies, and the ironworks of the coming industrial age. Their scarlet cloaks disappeared from the Trongate. Their mansions became banks. Their names became streets. But the crop itself was about to find an even greater engine of wealth on the other side of the Atlantic, in the hands of a boy nobody had heard of yet. Roll a cigarette by hand, with practice, and you can produce perhaps 4 in a minute. That was the ceiling of the industry for its entire history until the spring of 1881, when a shy, gangly 18-year-old from Rowan County, Virginia, named James Albert Bonsack, filed U.S. Patent number 238,640 for a machine that would rewrite the trade. The device was a long belt-fed contraption of rollers, blades, and a paste wheel that took loose tobacco in at one end and spat finished, glued, cut cigarettes out the other. Its output, once he tuned it, was 200 cigarettes a minute. A single Bonsack could do the work of 48 skilled hand rollers, day and night, and it never asked for a raise. The tobacco industry, in an act of what would later look like collective self-sabotage, refused to buy it. Hand-rolled was quality. Machine-rolled was suspect. No one wanted to invest. Then a lanky, restless 28-year-old from Durham, North Carolina, walked into Bonsack's workshop. James Buchanan Duke, Buck Duke to his family, had grown up on a small tobacco farm his father Washington Duke had returned to after the Civil War with 50 cents in his pocket. Buck had watched his father hand-cut, pack, and peddle bags of loose, smoking tobacco door to door. He had no interest in slow craft. In 1884, he leased 2 Bonsack machines exclusively, then quietly negotiated a secret royalty rate 25% below what any competitor could get. He guaranteed Bonsack the volume. Bonsack gave him the price. Within a year, Duke's Durham factory could produce more cigarettes in one day than his 4 largest rivals combined could produce in a week. He then did something the industry had also never done. He spent the savings on advertising. Duke poured what would today be nearly 20% of revenue into billboards, trade cards, coupons, and, most notoriously, flat cardboard photographs of scantily clad actresses tucked inside every cigarette pack. Adults collected them. Boys traded them. Sales exploded. By 1889, Duke's brand, Duke of Durham, was selling 940 million cigarettes a year, more than all 4 of his competitors combined. That is the point at which he stopped being a manufacturer and became a monopolist. In January 1890, Duke summoned the heads of the 4 rival firms he had been undercutting to a private meeting at the Hoffman House Hotel in New York City. He offered each of them stock in a new combined venture. They accepted. The American Tobacco Company was born that day, and within a decade it controlled roughly 90% of every cigarette, plug, and cigar sold in the United States, and about 40% of the entire world market. Duke's holdings stretched from Durham, North Carolina, to the Ottoman tobacco fields of the Balkans, to a British subsidiary, Imperial Tobacco, that he strong-armed into being when British firms merged in self-defense in 1901. The scale of the fortune is worth pausing on. When Duke died in 1925, his personal estate was valued at around $100 million, roughly $1.7 billion in today's money. He had already, in 1924, endowed Trinity College in Durham, North Carolina, with $40 million on the condition that it rename itself. It did. It still bears the name Duke University. Its Gothic quads, its medical school, its basketball arena, all of it stands on cigarette money, and the machine that made all of this possible was still humming, faster with every decade. By 1925, a single improved Bonsack descendant could roll 1,500 cigarettes a minute. By 1950, machines were doing 4,000. Cigarettes had become the cheapest addictive product ever engineered by industrial civilization, a factor that mattered enormously when the trench soldiers of the First World War came home hooked, and when their sons and daughters lit up in the 50s and 60s without a single warning label in sight. But behind every dollar of that fortune was labor. And behind that labor was a shadow the industry had cast for 300 years and had never once paid for. Tobacco is not a forgiving plant. It demands attention for roughly 14 months from seedbed to sale, longer than any grain, longer than cotton, longer than sugar. It has to be transplanted by hand, topped by hand, wormed by hand. The tobacco hornworm, a fat green caterpillar, will strip a plant in a day and had to be pinched off between finger and thumb. Harvested leaf by leaf as each ripens, hung to cure, stripped, sorted, and pressed into hogsheads, great wooden barrels roughly 1,000 pounds full. There is no season of rest. The moment one crop is packed, the next year's seedbed must already be sprouting. In the early Chesapeake, Virginia, and Maryland in the 1620s and 1630s, that work was mostly done by young English indentured servants, bound for 4 to 7 years in exchange for their passage. But the death rate was appalling. Malaria, dysentery, and exhaustion killed roughly 40% of new arrivals within their first year, and those who survived aged out of their contracts and demanded land. The planters were running out of workers. The pivot to enslaved African labor was neither sudden nor uniform, but the direction was clear. The first documented Africans landed at Point Comfort, at the mouth of the James River, in August 1619, 20 or so people taken from a Portuguese slave ship called the São João Bautista by English privateers. Their exact legal status in Virginia in that first generation is still argued by historians. Some records suggest they were treated as indentured servants who could and did earn freedom. But over the next 80 years, colonial legislatures methodically closed every door. In 1662, Virginia ruled that a child's status followed the mother, not the father, meaning any child born to an enslaved woman was born enslaved. In 1667, the same colony declared that Christian baptism did not confer freedom, and in October 1705, the House of Burgesses passed the sweeping Act Concerning Servants and Slaves, which fused 24 earlier laws into a single, ruthlessly comprehensive slave code. Enslaved Africans were declared real estate, inheritable and taxable like land. Killing one during correction was not a crime. Any black person off a plantation without a written pass could be seized on sight. The 1705 code did not create Chesapeake slavery. It nailed it shut. By 1710, there were more enslaved Africans than white indentured servants in Virginia. By 1750, there were roughly 100,000 enslaved people in the colony, most of them working tobacco, on plantations along the Rappahannock, the York, and the James. The day began before dawn and ended by lantern. A first-hand account by the enslaved carpenter and later fugitive Charles Ball, published in 1837, describes tobacco worming as work so tedious that overseers would force any enslaved child caught missing a hornworm to swallow it whole. The wooden hogsheads themselves, those 1,000-pound barrels, were rolled by hand down rolling roads cut through the Virginia forest to the tidewater ports. Some of those old rolling roads are still visible today as the traces of modern highways. Route 5 out of Richmond, parts of Route 249, and the sunken lanes around Williamsburg all follow paths first pressed into the ground by enslaved feet pushing barrels of leaf. By the American Revolution, roughly 40% of the Virginia population, some 200,000 human beings, were enslaved, and the largest single reason was tobacco. George Washington's Mount Vernon and Thomas Jefferson's Monticello both began as tobacco plantations. Jefferson wrote openly in his own correspondence that tobacco was a culture productive of infinite wretchedness. He continued to plant it and to hold in bondage the people who worked it until the day he died. The cost was not confined to the Chesapeake. It traveled with the leaf into every place a cigar was rolled or a match was struck. Step into a Havana cigar factory around 1866. The Partagas works on Calle Industria, say, one of the largest in Cuba. And the first thing you notice is not the smell of tobacco. It is a single male voice, reading aloud, echoing from a raised wooden platform in the center of the room. Below him, 300 or 400 rollers sit at long tables, hands moving in constant, patient motion, shaping wrapper leaves around filler bunches. They are listening to Victor Hugo's Les Miserables, chapter by chapter, in Spanish translation. The novel is so popular on the rolling floor that when Hugo's publishers send a token of thanks to the workers of Havana, the workers vote to name a new cigar in his honor. Monte Cristo, one of the most famous cigar brands in the world, takes its name from another book, The Count of Monte Cristo, by Alexandre Dumas, read aloud in exactly this fashion, in a Cuban factory, to men whose hands never stopped. The reader had a job title, lector. He was elected by the workers, paid out of their own wages, and he read for 8 to 10 hours a day. He worked through the morning newspapers, then the political pamphlets, then the novels, then the poetry. It is one of the most extraordinary literary institutions of the 19th century, and it existed because cigar rolling was silent, tedious work that would otherwise crush the mind. It also, quietly, made Cuban cigar workers among the most politically educated laborers in the Americas. When Cuba's wars of independence broke out in 1868 and again in 1895, the lector had already read the manifestos aloud on the rolling floor. José Martí, the poet who led the independence movement, personally toured the Ybor City cigar factories in Tampa, Florida in the 1890s to raise funds, and he found rooms already primed for revolution by their readers. But the same rolling floors were sick. The condition was called green tobacco sickness, and modern medicine now recognizes it as acute nicotine poisoning through the skin. Rollers handling damp wrapper leaves absorb nicotine directly through the palms and forearms. Symptoms: vomiting, dizziness, cold sweats, pallor, struck new workers within their first weeks. Older rollers built up a partial tolerance, but they suffered chronic tremors, headaches, and, in the strippers' rooms where women pulled the central vein from each leaf by hand, high rates of miscarriage. The condition was not named in medical literature until 1970, but the workers had described it in Havana clinics for over a century, and the leaf's toll ran further still, into corners of the trade the leaf itself never touched. In London on 5 July 1888, roughly 1,400 young women and girls walked out of the Bryant and May match factory in Bow, in the East End. They rolled the wooden matches that lit every pipe and cigarette in the British Empire. The phosphorus tips of those matches gave off vapor that ate the jawbones of the girls who dipped them, a disfiguring, ultimately fatal condition called phosphorus necrosis, or, in the wards where sufferers went to die, phossy jaw. The strike, led by the socialist Annie Besant and a committee of the workers themselves, was one of the first successful industrial actions by women in British history. It forced Bryant and May to reform their conditions and, eventually, to switch to safer red phosphorus in 1901. But that flame in the pipe smoker's hand, the one flickering in a Bristol clay bowl or over a Havana cigar in a London club, had been lit at the cost of a 15-year-old girl's face. The picture is complete now. Tobacco built fortunes on stolen labor in Virginia. It sickened the hands that rolled it in Havana. It disfigured the girls who supplied the fire that lit it in London. And the world lit up regardless, because no one, in 1888, in 1918, in 1948, knew what the smoke itself was doing to their own lungs. That was about to change. In a small London office, in the spring of 1950, the British Medical Journal for the 29th of September 1950 carries an article 12 pages long, buried between reviews of surgical technique and a letter about penicillin dosing. Its title is drab: Smoking and Carcinoma of the Lung, Preliminary Report. Its authors, a 38-year-old epidemiologist named Richard Dahl and his supervisor Austin Bradford Hill, had spent the previous 3 years interviewing 649 lung cancer patients in 20 London hospitals about their smoking habits, and comparing them with 649 hospital patients matched for age and sex who did not have lung cancer. The result was so overwhelming that Dahl later said he changed his own habits before the paper went to press. Heavy smokers were around 50 times more likely to develop lung cancer than non-smokers. Dahl walked out of University College Hospital that summer, went home to his flat, and quietly gave up the pipe he had smoked since medical school. The tobacco industry did not accept it. In December 1953, the presidents of the largest American manufacturers, American Tobacco, R.J. Reynolds, Philip Morris, Brown & Williamson, and others, met in secret at the Plaza Hotel in New York. They hired the public relations firm Hill & Knowlton. On the 4th of January 1954, they took out a full-page advertisement in more than 400 American newspapers titled "A Frank Statement to Cigarette Smokers." It promised joint industry research into the health question and denied the emerging evidence. Internal documents later subpoenaed in the 1990s show that on the very day the ad ran, senior executives already believed, in private, that cigarettes caused lung cancer. They spent the next 4 decades saying otherwise, but the science did not slow down. Dahl and Hill enrolled 40,000 British doctors in a long-term follow-up study in 1951, the British Doctors' Study, and by 1956 the mortality curves were undeniable even to the most stubborn general practitioners in the country. In 1957, the British Medical Research Council formally accepted a causal link. On the 11th of January 1964, the U.S. Surgeon General Luther Terry stepped up to a podium in the State Department auditorium in Washington and, before a room of jittery reporters, released a 387-page report affirming that cigarette smoking caused lung cancer in men and probably in women. Because he timed the announcement for a Saturday, the stock market would have 24 hours to absorb the shock before Monday's open. That was a courtesy the industry did not extend to its own customers. Regulation came slowly, then in a rush. The Cigarette Labeling Act of 1965 put the first Surgeon General's warning on every American pack. Britain banned television cigarette advertising in 1965. In the United States, at midnight on the 2nd of January 1971, radio and television cigarette advertising was banned outright by federal law. The last commercial for Virginia Slims aired at 11:59 p.m. on New Year's Day, on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. The Marlboro Man, the cowboy who had ridden across American television for 15 years, disappeared from the airwaves overnight. Norway banned all tobacco advertising in 1975. Ireland became the first country in the world to ban smoking in enclosed workplaces in March 2004. And within a decade, most of Western Europe had followed. A 400-year-old industry was, for the first time, being dismantled by the state, but the manufacturers still had one great battle left, and it would drain more money out of them than any court order in history. In the spring of 1994, in a windowless committee room in the U.S. Capitol, the chief executives of the 7 largest American tobacco companies stood in a row, raised their right hands, and swore under oath before Congressman Henry Waxman's subcommittee that they did not believe nicotine was addictive. The clip aired on the evening news that same night. Within weeks, a small-town lawyer in Pascagoula, Mississippi named Mike Moore, the state's attorney general, filed the first lawsuit by a U.S. state to recover Medicaid costs from cigarette-caused illness. 45 other state attorneys general joined him, and on the 23rd of November 1998, in a signing ceremony in Washington, the industry surrendered. The Master Settlement Agreement is the largest civil legal settlement in the history of the United States. Its price tag ran to $206 billion, paid out to 46 participating states over 25 years, and continuing after that in perpetuity. 4 other states had already settled separately for another $40 billion. The industry agreed to dissolve the Tobacco Institute, its lobbying arm, to release millions of pages of internal documents into a public archive that still sits on the University of California, San Francisco servers, to stop marketing to children, to remove Joe Camel and the Marlboro Man from billboards forever. Every American cigarette pack sold since 1998 has carried a per-carton contribution to that settlement, buried in the retail price. The other blow came 6 years later. In October 2004, President George W. Bush signed the Fair and Equitable Tobacco Reform Act, ending the federal tobacco price support and quota system that had guaranteed American growers a minimum price and a guaranteed market since 1938. Farmers were compensated with a one-time buyout, around $9.6 billion split among more than 400,000 quota holders, but the guaranteed market vanished the moment the ink dried. The effect on the fields was devastating and swift. In 1997, there were roughly 124,000 tobacco farms in the United States. By 2012, there were fewer than 10,000. Whole counties in eastern Kentucky, central North Carolina, and southern Virginia, places where the local high school football team had been named the Warriors, or the Bulldogs, or, in one Kentucky town, the Cardinals, but where the town itself was called Tobacco, watched their curing barns collapse into their own foundations. The distinctive dark curing barn, with its vertical slats hinged to open for airflow, is now the most photographed abandoned structure in the American South, more common along the back roads of the Piedmont than any silo or grain elevator. The trade itself did not die. It migrated. By 2020, China was producing over 40% of the world's tobacco leaf, and Chinese state-owned manufacturer China Tobacco was selling roughly 2.4 trillion cigarettes a year, more than the next 29 companies combined. Zimbabwe, Malawi, and Brazil expanded their fields as the American ones went fallow. And in Western markets, a new product, the electronic cigarette, patented by a Chinese pharmacist named Hun Like in 2003 after his father died of lung cancer, began quietly reintroducing nicotine addiction to a generation that had never touched a leaf. The great American tobacco fortunes of the 20th century still exist, but they no longer answer to tobacco. Philip Morris International, spun off in 2008, still sells Marlboros outside the United States. Reynolds American was absorbed by British American Tobacco in 2017. The old American Tobacco Company that James Buchanan Duke built in 1890 was broken up by antitrust order in 1911, and its pieces have been merging and demerging ever since. A 400-year-old trade did not so much die as scatter, and what it left behind, in the world you walk through every day, is stranger than most people ever notice. Think about what this leaf did. It began in the hands of Andean farmers 8,000 years ago. It rose as smoke in Mayan temples. It sealed alliances in Taino villages that no longer exist. It saved Jamestown from starvation. It filled the coffee houses where Lloyd's of London and the Royal Society were born. It built the mansions of the Glasgow tobacco lords and the paving of a street they named after the colony that grew it. It chained hundreds of thousands of Africans to the soil of Virginia and Maryland. It funded the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, chartered in 1693 partly on tobacco revenue, still the second oldest university in the United States. It rolled itself into the fingers of Havana workers listening to Les Miserables. It disfigured the girls who made the matches that lit it. It made James Buchanan Duke rich enough to buy a university and put his name on it. It survived world wars, world's fairs, and cinema's entire golden age, when Humphrey Bogart lit 2 cigarettes at once in Now, Voyager, and made a nation swoon. And then, in the space of a single human lifetime, it killed roughly 100 million people in the 20th century alone, a figure the World Health Organization publishes not as an estimate, but as a floor. And now walk out your front door. You will find its ghost immediately. The word nicotine itself comes from Jean Nicot, the French ambassador to Portugal. who in 1560 sent tobacco seeds to Catherine de' Medici at the French court as a cure for her migraines. His surname is now the chemical name for the molecule that killed the most people in modern history. In Glasgow, Virginia Street still runs from Argyle Street north to Ingram Street, and its cobbles still shine after rain. In Bristol, if you dig a garden bed in the old city, you will still find clay pipe stems in the soil. In Italy and Portugal, there are families today with the surname Tobacco, or Tobacco, descendants of the men who first imported the leaf into Europe. In Havana, the Partagas factory still stands on Calle Industria, though tourists now outnumber lectors. In North Carolina, Duke University's chapel spire is visible for miles above Durham, and the money that raised it can be traced, dollar by dollar, back to the Bonsack machine. And then there is the stranger on the street corner, thumb on a small metal device, exhaling a white vapor that smells faintly of cotton candy. He is inhaling a nicotine salt engineered in a Chinese laboratory in 2003, delivered in an aerosol first sold commercially in 2004, marketed by companies whose parent corporations descend in an unbroken line of mergers from the American Tobacco Company that James Buchanan Duke founded at the Hoffman House Hotel in 1890, from the Bonsack machine leased in 1884, from John Rolfe's smuggled seeds sown in 1611, from a Taino cohiba shared on Hispaniola in the 10th century, from a Mayan priest's rolled bundle at Palenque, from a plant that Andean farmers first bent to their will 8,000 years ago on a hillside now gone. Rodrigo de Jerez was jailed as a devil for exhaling that same smoke. The world he was punished for entering is the world you live in now. If a piece of this story surprised you, a turn you never knew, a name you never connected, leave it in the comments below. And if tobacco once shaped your own family's story, in a Kentucky curing barn, a Cuban rolling floor, a Scottish counting house, or a hospital ward in the 1970s, I would especially like to hear that. Subscribe if you'd like more of the forgotten trades and lost worlds hiding, in plain sight, behind the everyday things you thought you knew.